Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here. We're going to bring up Jeffrey Bewley. He's going to talk about revealing the benefits of precision technology on our dairy. So my name is Dan Weiland. I'm the U.S. Dairy Business Manager for Alltech. And on behalf of Alltech, I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Bewley. He's from Rineyville, Kentucky. He grew up on his grandfather's dairy farm, got his Bachelor of Science in Animal Science from the University of Kentucky, his Master's in Dairy Science from the University of Wisconsin, and then he got his PhD in Applied Economics and Precision Dairy Technologies from Purdue University. And currently, he worked for 9.5 years for the University in Kentucky in the Extension Department, and is currently working for Alltech as on our on-farm support team, and works as the Dairy Housing and Analytics Specialist. Jeffrey has published numerous papers. He spoke all over the world when it comes to precision technology and really understanding where this whole frontier of new information is going. He is one of the best. Trust me there. Before I bring up Jeffrey, I got to mention this. He is a die-hard University of Kentucky Wildcat fan, and I always tell him the greatest game I ever watched was when the University of Wisconsin beat the Wildcats to end their perfect season. So I love to give him a hard time on that. So Jeffrey, come, well, give him a round of applause.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks everybody for coming this morning. Appreciate the invitation to come speak here today. I'll have to say that was not the greatest game in my mind. I remember actually kind of collapsing in disappointment after that game, but I switched colors real quickly because I am also a Wisconsin graduate, and so I put my red on as soon as I picked myself up off the floor, and then hoped for that win against Duke, and then unfortunately that didn't happen, but it was a great season for the Badgers. I'm here today to talk to you guys about technology, and specifically precision dairy management technologies and some of the opportunities that we have in front of us. I think it's really quite exciting what we have available to us on dairy farms today. I think it's even more exciting when we think about what's coming on the horizon in terms of technologies. That being said, I think there's some cautions that we have to recognize with technologies, and I'm also going to talk about some of those things that we need to consider. It's not all rainbows and flowers. There's some challenges that we have to think about, and I think it's important if we're on dairy farms that if you're a dairy farmer yourself, that you think through some of these questions, or if you're an advisor for a dairy producer, that you think about some of these questions that we need to ask, because it's not all wonderful. There are some challenges, and I'm going to talk about both. I spent about the last 15 years working in this area, from developing technologies to evaluating existing technologies to looking at the economics of the technology and thinking about some of the social factors associated with adoption of the technology. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those here today. When we look at today's progressive dairies, we see that I think for the most part we have well-managed nutrition, excellent cow comfort, good genetics, low somatic cell counts, disease, and reproductive management largely under control. Now, of course, we see farms that don't necessarily have all these things, but in general, the level of management of the dairy farms that have survived the last 15 to 20 years is very high. And I know that in my career, it's changed dramatically to where when I go to a farm, it's very rare that I walk into the farm and find something that I consider extremely low-hanging fruit, like maybe you should use pre-dip or post-dip. That would help with your somatic cell count problems. Now, I did run into one of those about 3 weeks ago, but it's rare when we have that level of ease in working with dairy producers, because we've worked through most of those kinds of issues. I think that as we move forward, analytics is going to be the next scientific breakthrough. It's amazing when we think about how much progress we've made in the dairy industry with regards to the biology of the animal. What we've been able to do in terms of nutritional management, reproductive management, genetic progress, etc., is really quite amazing. I think sometimes we should step back and recognize how much progress we've made in the dairy industry. And to me, that next breakthrough is really in the use of data and the use of analytics to better manage the operations that we work with. Aidan Conley talks about the 8 disruptive technologies on dairy farm operations. We look at things like robots, drones, 3D printing, and sensors. All of these are the things that are going to be part of what's termed the Internet of Things. And then the techniques that are used to explore these data are artificial intelligence, blockchain technologies, virtual reality, augmented reality, etc. There's a whole lot of things that we're able to take from other industries and bring those into the dairy industry. When you look at the exciting technologies that are coming to us in dairy farms, it's really interesting when we see that actually most of what we're doing is adopting technologies that have been applied in other industries. How many of you know what an accelerometer is? How many of you think you are carrying an accelerometer with you today? Most of you probably are. So an accelerometer is a technology, it's a sensor that measures motion in 3 dimensions. And most of us carry at least one of them with us at all times in our smartphones. Our smartphones have accelerometers. That's what changes the orientation of the screen when we change the orientation of the phone. It's what measures the activity of the phone. And when we look at things like Fitbits, it's what's in your Fitbit. Now, clearly, I'm not using my Fitbit very well, but Fitbits are accelerometer-based technologies. And we've been able to take that accelerometer technology and bring it into the dairy industry. So most of the wearable technologies that we see in the dairy industry can very much be defined as Fitbits for cows. It made my world a lot easier when people say, what do you do? People outside of the dairy industry, I just tell them I work with Fitbits for cows, because that's what we're talking about. We take a technology applied largely in other industries and we use it for cows. What are we doing with accelerometers for cows? We're using that technology to measure activity. We're using it to measure things like rumination and feeding time, etc. So it's really neat what we've been able to do with that technology. And the reason we're able to do it so widely in the dairy industry is because that technology is actually pretty cheap. How much can you buy an accelerometer for? You could go on Amazon and buy an accelerometer for about $1. The actual technology is fairly cheap. Using the data from that technology, though, is the challenge and the opportunity. In general, when we refer to precision dairy monitoring, what we're talking about is looking at some individual variables that we're measuring on the same cow across time. We might be looking at something within the milk. We might be looking at a behavioral measure. We might be looking at something that's looking at the conformation of the animal, or we may be looking at the physiology of the animal. So there are a lot of different variables that we might measure. And in general, what we're doing with precision dairy monitoring is we're moving back to the idea of managing individual animals. I grew up on a 65 cow dairy. We knew each cow very well. But when that's 6,500 cows or 65,000 cows, we don't have the ability to remember and understand and know each cow. These technologies, though, provide us that opportunity to go back to managing the individual cow, because they tell us a tremendous amount of information going on with each individual animal within the herd. How many of you have ever read the book Competing on Analytics? Nobody. That's really disappointing. It's a great book. In fact, it's my favorite book. The next time you go to the beach, I encourage you to get a copy of Competing on Analytics and read it on the beach. And I assure you that everybody who's walking by on the beach will say, there's a cool guy. He is reading a really cool book. I should read that book too. Probably not, but it is a very interesting book. And I really enjoyed reading this book. It's actually getting a little bit old. It's probably about 12, 13 years old now. The book Competing on Analytics talks about how businesses use analytics as a source of competitive advantage. And really, when you read this book, you see how clear the opportunity is for the dairy operation. We are really prime for using data because we have a lot of similar things on the farm. We have animals that do the same things every day, and we have a lot of data capture capabilities on our farms. The examples it uses are companies like Netflix and Amazon and grocery stores, how they use analytics to gain a competitive advantage over other businesses. And we see very quickly, if you read this book, how those opportunities are there. So I think as we move forward, this is one of the places that's going to differentiate those top dairies from the average dairies, is the ability to use information to look for opportunities, particularly in tight times. Now this graph talks about how we gain competitive advantage as we move up this graph. So basically, when we're on the bottom quadrant, we're looking at what we call descriptive analytics. And this is basically looking at what happened. In the dairy industry, we've done a nice job for a long time in descriptive analytics. Our herd management software programs, our DairyComp, PCDart, BovaSync, etc., those programs do a great job of descriptive analytics. How many cows had calves? What's our conception rate? What's our pregnancy rate? What's our somatic cell count by stage of lactation? All those kinds of questions are descriptive, and we're great at that. Unfortunately, we usually stop there. We don't move up this chart, and this is where the opportunity lies. We need to, and we'll get more into diagnostic analytics. Why did something happen? Looking retrospectively. Predictive analytics. What will happen? What's going to happen moving forward? And then the highest level is getting into prescriptive analytics. What can we do to make it happen? So we have a massive opportunity to move up this chart in terms of analytic competition. When I look at the cow, I see a lot of stories that cow can tell us. I'm a cow guy. I grew up on a farm and I really love cows. This is actually a cow from our home farm from 30 years ago. And I see a lot of stories, and I spend a lot of time when I'm on farms trying to read what cows have to tell us. And if you look at the variables listed on this cow, you see a lot of things that we probably do a reasonable job of at least keeping our eye on. So even if we don't necessarily measure and record body condition score or locomotion score, we at least are looking for this as we're looking at our animals. We're looking to see how many cows are eating or how many cows are ruminating, even if we don't necessarily measure those variables. But with technologies now, we have the ability to measure each of the variables listed on this slide. We can monitor all these things all the time for all of our animals. Now, to some degree, that's exciting. I could know all these pieces of information about each animal in the herd. But I also think it's kind of overwhelming, because just because I can measure something doesn't necessarily mean that I should measure it, right? We could measure all these things, but if we bought the technologies to measure all these things, we don't need to run an economic model to understand that we just sunk our business, because it would cost too much money to buy all these technologies. We very quickly run into a scenario where the value of the technologies on the farm per cow is more than the value of the cows. And we can't go that direction. We have to be careful. So we have to prioritize and think about which variables are important. Which of these pieces of information provide us the most meaningful information? And my guess is that if we polled the group here, we would find a wide variety of answers as to what the most useful piece of information would be. And ultimately, it's not just about what's useful and what's interesting, but it's what can we do with that information. We have to be able to turn that information into a meaningful decision. Just because I know something doesn't mean I can do something about it. If I take something like heart rate, what can I do with heart rate? I can have a technology that can measure heart rate. Do I need a technology that can measure heart rate? What decision am I going to be able to make with that? I struggle a little bit more with the value of that kind of technology. Now, a few years ago, I was at a meeting in Pennsylvania, and the farmer in the back of the room raised his hand, and he told me, he said, Jeffrey, he said, you're absolutely wrong. I want a technology that's going to tell me heart rate. Because if I have a technology that's going to tell me heart rate, then I'm going to be able to identify a cow that's going to have a heart attack. And if I'm able to identify a cow that's going to be able to have a heart attack, then I'm able to walk her to the dead pile instead of having to drag her there afterward. So I guess if you're creative, you can figure out something to do with any piece of information, but I challenge you to find that that's an economical decision to measure it in that way. And we look at what's out there. We have a lot of different technologies out there, and I kind of break it down into 3 different areas. The wearable technologies, these would be the sensors, the neck tags, the leg tags, the ear tags, etc. Milk analysis technologies, and image analysis technologies. And we look at the marketplace and we very quickly see there are a lot of technologies out there. And it seems like at least once a month we get some kind of a press release coming across our dairy newsletters that says, here's a new technology for us. So I think as a dairy producer, it's quite overwhelming to think about this. Which technology applies to me? I talked to a farmer last week at a meeting out in Utah, and he said to me, he said, Jeffrey, he said, I want to buy a technology, but I don't know which one. I think I should just wait until the next thing comes out, till the best thing comes out. And I said, you can wait for sure, but you'll always be waiting if that's the case, because there's always going to be something better. This area is moving very, very rapidly. We're going to continue to see more, newer, and better technologies come out. What we're using today might not even be around 10 years from now. There are some really, really good technologies out there today that are worth investing in, and there are more coming down the line. In general, what we're looking at with these precision dairy technologies is we're looking at a management by exception type of approach. So we look at something like this where we have activity levels, we have some natural variation, and we're looking at activity that's going along at some baseline level, and then whenever the cow comes into heat, there's a massive increase in activity, and then it goes back down to normal. This is estrus detection. We're looking for these deviations. And this is the reason why estrus detection technologies have been the most widely adopted so far. This works. This concept works very well. It's relatively easy to find this increase in activity regardless of where the technology is located. But estrus was the easy one. Why is it easier than disease? Mainly because whenever we're looking at this, there's a dramatic change and it's very quick and very overnight. When we look at something like disease detection, it's not as clear cut. We have changes that occur across time. We have changes because the cow moves from clinical to subclinical states of disease. We have the complexity of multiple types of disease that might give us the same behavior. And then the last thing that we have to think about is that just because we have an indication that the animal is becoming sick doesn't necessarily mean we know exactly what to do about that. With estrus detection, we know exactly what to do and when to do it. With disease detection, it's not quite as clear. That being said, I think that's where the bigger opportunity lies moving forward. We have massive opportunities sitting in front of us in terms of mastitis detection, fresh cow disease detection, lameness detection, calving detection technologies. We have new genetic traits that will come on board. Because when we look at something like body condition score or locomotion score, we would like to have included these things in our genetic evaluations for many years. Breeding for a cow that doesn't lose a lot of body condition score, for example, or breeding for cows that are less likely to become lame. And we're doing some of that now. But we couldn't have done that very well because we didn't have a phenotype to be able to put into our genetic evaluations. Now with technologies, we have new phenotypes. We have new information that we can bring into our genetic evaluations. And we have more accurate information in many cases because we're recording variables more frequently. And then I think, although we spent a lot of time talking about monitoring individual animals, we can't forget about the opportunity to use this same information to manage the herd or manage groups within the herd. There's a lot of valuable information that comes out of looking at averages of these and changes in averages of these variables within the herd. In general, when we're talking about disease detection, the basic concept is we're looking to detect that disease sooner than what we would be able to without a technology. The idea is that if we're able to detect that disease sooner, then we're more likely to have a positive outcome from treating that condition. This, I think, is particularly important in the fresh period, because if we're able to identify an animal that's early in that whole complex, that domino effect of conditions that occurs in early lactation, then we're able to cut that off and stop that animal from continuing down that domino track. Now, this is a good theory, and I think it all is fairly intuitive to most of us. In reality, quantifying how much of an impact this is not necessarily always easy. There's not a lot of data showing us how much this impact is. And this is where one of the challenges comes in looking at the economics of these technologies, is trying to understand what is the real impact of identifying that animal early in the stage. Because one of the things that I think we have to be careful on is when we're looking at the economics of these technologies, not assuming that we eliminate all the cost of the disease. So for example, if I have a mastitis detection technology and that technology identifies a case of mastitis, and let's say I assume that the average case of mastitis is $300, I don't gain $300 there, right? Because that cow still had mastitis. There's still some impact of that disease. Hopefully, we reduce that impact of the case of mastitis from 300 to maybe 100 or 150 or something like that. But exactly what that number is, I don't think we have a great handle on as an industry at this point in time. Let's walk through some of the types of devices that are out there. We have a lot of devices that are monitoring variables on the leg. These devices are generally accelerometer-based technologies. They're looking at activity. They're looking at overall activity, number of steps that the animal takes, the amount of time the cow spends standing or lying down, and the number of times she spends, the number of times she gets up and down within the day. So a lot of valuable information that we have there for identifying cows that are in heat, for looking at cow comfort, for identifying cows that are becoming lame, becoming sick, etc., by looking at lying time. Now, one of the questions, though, becomes, if I have a cow that goes from being non-lame to lame, does she start lying down more or less? How many people say more? Lame cow starts lying down more. How many people say less? Everybody's right. Some lame cows lay down more, some lame cows lay down less. What about mastitis? A cow gets mastitis, does she lay down more or less? Same thing, some more, some less. These relationships aren't always linear. And I think there's an important part of complexity that we have to recognize here, is that we tend to oversimplify disease. We tend to call lameness, lameness, and mastitis, mastitis. But in reality, we should expect different responses depending on what type of lameness. A cow with a hairy heel wart is probably going to behave differently than a cow with a sole ulcer. A cow with E. coli mastitis is going to behave differently than a cow with Staph aureus. So we should expect some differences there. That being said, I think there's a lot of potential value with these line behavior technologies. We also have a lot of devices that are ear-based technologies. So these technologies, again, most of them are using an accelerometer. They're looking at motion and they're measuring activity. But with these technologies, we can also monitor feeding time and rumination time. Now, when I first heard about this idea, I thought, how in the heck can you measure feeding time and rumination time from the ear? And if you have that question, you wonder that, I encourage you the next time you're out watching cows to go watch a cow eat, watch a cow ruminate, watch her ear. You'll see it's a very consistent motion. It's actually very easy for an accelerometer to pick up these changes in behavior. We validated some of these technologies, and I can tell you that some of them work really, really well at monitoring feeding time and rumination time. We also have technologies like this SmartBow technology. It's the white tag in the picture here. That's actually a real-time location system. So with the real-time location system, it's basically GPS for cows. We know the exact position of every cow in the herd at every second. So we can use this to find cows in large herds, but we can also use this information to understand where cows are spending their time, How much time does the cow spend at the feed bunk? How much time does each cow spend at the water? How much time in the freestall, etc.? And looking at changes in where they spend their time as an indication of something going on with that animal. Another device that we see here is something called the fever tag. This tag is actually a probe that goes into the ear canal, and that's measuring temperature. It's a great idea. It's great temperature if we can get in the ear canal, because this is looking at what's called tympanic temperature, very close to the hypothalamus. Wonderful idea. There's a little problem though. We worked with this technology a few years ago, and we were really excited about getting this technology. We put it in all the cows in the herd. The next morning, my graduate student at the time, she sent me a text message, and she said, Jeffrey, she said, we have a little problem. About half the cows have gotten the probe out of the ear. What do I do? I said, that's simple. Go chase the cows and shove the probe back in their ear. So she said, okay. And so she did that. And the next day, she texted me and she said, same problem. About half the cows have gotten the probe out of the ear. What do I do? I said, same thing you did yesterday. She did that. Third day, she comes back and she says, I don't think this is going to work. She's right. Guess what? The cow doesn't like having a probe shoved in her ear. And she'll do everything possible to get that out of her ear. So very practical applications that we have to think about here. There's another tag that we worked with, a little bit of a design flaw perhaps in the ear tag. It really got caught on things often, and it ripped out of the ear frequently. Probably enough to be even a well-being issue. Now that company's worked on that tag design. I think it's better now, but if we have 10% of the tags that rip out each week, which was really the case in this particular technology, that's not very practical. That's not very feasible to keep up with that kind of a technology. We also have a lot of monitors that sit on the cow's neck. So these monitors are also in general looking at activity, rumination time, eating time, same concepts as the ear tags, and can be quite effective for measuring these variables. We have devices that sit in the rumen. More technically, they probably sit in the reticulum. Now, we've looked and seen a lot of companies go in with a rumen bolus for measuring temperature over the year. And if you've noticed, a lot of those companies have come and gone. Why do you think that is? What's the biggest challenge with measuring rumen temperature? Every time a cow drinks water, there's a dramatic drop in temperature. And it takes 2 to 3 hours before the temperature comes back to normal. So you end up with a lot of garbage data that ends up having to be thrown away. The most useful thing we've been able to figure out that rumen temperature could be used for is actually for identifying how much water the cow drinks, because that drop is pretty consistent and pretty easy to pick up. So there's one real challenge there with rumen temperature. We also have devices that measure rumen pH, which is really kind of a neat idea, being able to look at rumen pH, being able to identify acidosis. There's some challenges there. If I'm a scientist and I'm sitting in a lab and I'm looking at rumen pH, what do I do with my pH meter? Every time I use it, I'm going to calibrate it. How do I calibrate a pH device when it's in a cow's rumen? I don't. So these sensors tend to drift over time. The other challenge with this, and I think it's quite a practical challenge, is that these devices are generally about $600 a piece for the cheapest one that I'm aware of, and those devices only have a battery life of about 100 to 150 days. So probably not very economical at this point, but perhaps somewhere down the line. We also have devices that look at calving detection. And there are two different main approaches for looking at calving detection. One of them is the device, that's the blue device here. It's actually a probe, a vaginal temperature probe. A lot of people don't recognize, but there's a dramatic drop in temperature that occurs about 24 to 48 hours before calving. So this technology is used to identify that drop. And then whenever the cow calves, it expels the device, and there's also a change in temperature, particularly on a day like today, when the device leaves the animal to give us an alert that that animal's calving. This device sounds interesting, probably not practical long term because we have to put the device in, and it's probably not the most comfortable device for the animal. The other device that you see here is the MUcall device, which I think is an interesting idea. It's basically like a wristwatch or a Fitbit for the tail. It goes on the tail of the animal, and we're looking at a change in activity as the animal approaches calving. Great idea. Now, I'm not a detail person, so I got this technology for a project, handed it to a student and said, figure out how to use this. She comes back a couple of days later and she says, do you realize that you can only leave this device on the cow for 4 days? I said, no, that's a detail. I did not notice that. Now, why can you only leave it on the cow for 4 days? Because if you have that device on the animal for longer than 4 days, it actually can cut off the blood flow to the tail, and then we unintentionally dock the tail. So probably not a direction we want to go back down. There's a real challenge there, a real practical limitation. The other thing is, if you have this device and you have grooming brushes, the cows will do everything they can to back up to that grooming brush and get it off. So it's that balance of keeping it on the cow. Now, if it's on the cow, it does a wonderful job, but we have this challenge. And certainly, if you think about that 4-day limitation, you have to be watching the cows pretty closely in the first place to be able to identify the 4-day. So one of the challenges we had in our early project was we didn't have the device on the cow when she calved because we didn't pick up that fast enough. If she was 10 days early, she didn't have the device on. There is another concept to calving detection which probably actually holds a lot more potential down the line, and that's using existing technologies like the lying behavior monitors or rumination behavior monitors to identify calving time. For example, a cow that as she approaches calving, she gets up and down a lot. So we can use that kind of technology to identify when the cow is going to calve also. Another behavior that we think about, and this is more of a research project type idea at this point, but we think about monitoring sleep. So why did we think about monitoring sleep? Look at the cow in this video. These cows are clearly in a deep REM sleep. How many of you ever watched cows sleep? A few. They sleep a lot more when they're in a more comfortable environment. So we've done a nice job for a number of years talking about rest quantity, but we've not really gotten as much into rest quality. How much of an impact does rest quality have on immune function? I think this is an interesting concept and idea. And when we see cows in loose housing systems like this, we see a lot more deep REM sleep. So is there potential value for that? And is this something we should be measuring to identify cow comfort? This was a research device that we looked at, and you can tell it's a research device compared to a practical device because it has a lot of duct tape on it. So all good research involves duct tape in my mind. What should we look for in terms of wearable technologies? First of all, I think we need to have something that's easy to attach to the cow. It needs to stay attached to the cow without causing abrasions or injuries. It needs to have a battery life of at least 3 to 5 years. I don't get too worried if we're talking about 8-year, 10-year battery lives because I think we're going to change technologies by then. How many of you have the same cell phone you had 10 years ago? There's probably a few people, but for the most part, we change technologies faster than that, and I think that's the case with these kinds of technologies also. I want a technology that can transmit data without interruptions, that it stores enough data to withstand a system failure. These systems will fail. There are things that just happen. Lightning happens, raccoons happen, mice happen, and there's times when we have to deal with those kinds of an issue. And I want to be able to have a system that's able to record that data while the system's down. And I want to have less than 3% of the devices fail in a year. Not 0, I don't think that's realistic, but I really do see technologies that have less than 1 to 2% of their devices fail in a year. I also see technologies that have 10 to 20% of their devices fail in a week. There's a wide range in that, and we don't talk about this enough, but that technology needs to be able to withstand the conditions of the farm. Where's the best place to put a tag on the cow? Lots of varying opinions on this. And I think to some degree, it's like is a red tractor better or a green tractor better, etc. Some of it's just opinions. I think we just need to recognize there are differences. When we look at an ear, it's easy to put a tag on. It's a small size. They can get caught on things, can get ripped out. When we look at the when we look at the leg, it stays on well, a little bit harder to put on. And we have issues sometimes with manure collecting on that, particularly in dirtier environments. When we look at the neck, it's a logical location for behavior. It stays on well, but we have to think about the growth of the animal. First lactation cow, her neck's going to grow. A cow that's a reproductive problem that gets out to a 4 body condition score, her neck's going to grow. We're going to have to do some adjustments to the straps on those cows. The tail, like I said, good location for behavior, particularly with regard to calving, but there are some practical limitations to that. So I just think we have to compare and contrast which of those issues do we want to work with. There are valid reasons for each of those locations to work well and valid concerns with each of those locations. Where next? I think that we're going to see some subcutaneous type technologies. They're already out there being developed. The challenge that we'll have is whether or not these are okay with the FDA. Sometimes the FDA's not super excited about devices going under the skin, worried about them potentially ending up into the food supply. There are a lot of opportunities for parlour and image-based devices. We have things like the AffyLab technology. The AffyLab uses something called spectroscopy, looking at the pattern of light flowing through milk, and that's basically looking at things like fat, protein, and lactose in line, also looking at amino acids and fatty acids, so a tremendous amount of information with that, and there's no variable cost associated with that because there's no reagent there. We look at something like the DeLaval Herd Navigator, really a neat system. It measures progesterone. Being able to use progesterone from a reproductive management perspective opens up a whole wide range of possibilities. Really exciting to think about using that technology for estrus detection, pregnancy detection, abortion detection, etc. Also measures BHBA in line. So in robotic systems, even having a feedback loop to be able to automatically provide propylene glycol in the robot for animals that have subclinical ketosis. It measures LDH as an indication of mastitis. Lots of devices coming out now. They're just getting here on the robotic side, and they're coming quickly on the conventional parlour side to monitor individual animal somatic cell count, till we have somatic cell count every milking for every cow. Kind of exciting, but also some new challenges. If I have a technology that tells me the somatic cell count of every cow every milking, and I have a cow and she only goes up, spikes for a couple of milkings, and she goes back to normal, what was the right course of action with that cow? Some people might look and say, this cow has 1 million somatic cell count, let's treat her. But if I had that cow and she only went up for a couple milkings, isn't that exactly what I wanted to happen? Her body dealt with the infection and she rolled on. In reality, that happens every day on our farms. We have cows, they get mastitis, we don't see it, she deals with it and she rolls on. The cow is her best defense mechanism. So we have to be careful when we get some of these technologies and not overreacting, not overtreating. I think it's a really important consideration. So when we have this new information, it might change the way we look at identification of some of these conditions. Not reacting is sometimes the right decision. And then we look at image-based technologies, looking at something like body condition score. We have our first body condition scoring system out there now. Basically, with image analysis, we're looking at the patterns of the animal. So you look at this image here, you can clearly identify how you could use geometry to look at the angles around the hooks, the angles around the pins, to identify body condition score. That's the first thing that's out there, but lots of new things coming in terms of image analysis. And whereas today, this whole technology area is dominated by wearable technologies, I don't think the wearable technologies are going away, but I think we're going to see more and more technologies that are image-based and that are milk-based. We talked about some of the milk-based technologies. There are other opportunities for milk-based technologies, being able to look at things, for example, think about being able to look at the pregnancy-associated glycoproteins, being able to use those in line to identify when a cow becomes pregnant. Markers of inflammation, markers of metabolic conditions. I think there are a lot of biomarkers we don't even know are out there yet that we're going to be able to identify and measure in line that's going to change the way we manage the animals. And these move more toward looking at the physiology of the animal instead of indirect measures of what's going on with that animal. Another idea with image analysis, this was a project we worked on, basically looking at tracking the animal's limb movement using image analysis. This is a simple video camera, brilliant graduate student that I had from China working on this, basically tracking the motion of each limb, being able to identify that the left rear is moving a little bit slower than the right rear, that the stride is a little bit shorter, that it's different than it has been before, etc. Being able to use that kind of information for locomotion scoring. Here's another idea, basically using image analysis to identify feed intake. There's a pattern of light that goes across the feed here that puts a contour there, and you're looking at the change in that contour from when the cow, before the cow's eaten to after, to measure the amount of feed volume that's disappeared. I think feed intake is the holy grail of monitoring within the dairy industry. So some neat possibilities with that kind of technology. Genetic evaluations, like we talked about. I think there's some massive opportunities sitting in front of us for new traits, things like heat tolerance. We didn't touch on that one, but being able to use temperature changes to identify animals that are more heat tolerant. New markers of fertility. So for example, with these estrus detection systems, we know when the first actual heat is after calving. So days to first heat, or if we're looking at heifers, days to first heat, days to puberty basically. So being able to take that information in and bring it into our genetic evaluations. We have more accurate data because we're measuring more frequently, and we have fewer measurement errors. So let's take a step back and think about some of the realities of what's going on. Not everybody's impressed with these technologies. How do we avoid the drip dilemma, where we're data rich but information poor? We have a lot of challenges with data. Our financial and production information is not always connected well. We have inconsistent data entry, paper trails. We still have issues with rural connectivity that we have to keep in mind, lack of standardization, and I think a lot of people in the advisory network sometimes are confused. We have a lot of information sitting in silos. We have information from DHI systems, from sensor systems, from feed management software, genetics, milk buyers, financial information. It all sits in silos and it doesn't communicate very well with each other. This creates a big challenge and a limit for how we can use data in our operations. I think we have issues trying to understand how we handle data. What are we going to do? What kind of protocols do we have for handling alerts from systems? What do we do about those natural reactions from healthy cows? What about repeat alerts, failed devices? Well, do we have a backup plan for when the system's out? If I'm using this system as my main way of identifying heat detection or identifying when we have cows that are sick, what happens when lightning strikes and we're out for a couple days? How are we going to manage that? And then the other issue that I think we need to be having more and more conversations about is data security and data ownership. Who owns the data and how do we keep it secure to protect you as a dairy producer? What should we be looking for in software? For me, these are the items I'd like to see. I'd like to see a cloud-based interface. I want to see a smartphone application. I want to see a technology that addresses the needs of both visual and verbal learners, an intuitive user interface, interconnectivity with herd management software, really important that we be able to connect to our dairy comps and PC darts. We need a real-time data display, customer-focused training and support, and we need a refined alert list. If I have 1,000 cows, I want to see only the 5 or 10 or 15 that need attention showing up each day. We have some technology challenges and limitations we have to think about. What do we do about brand differences in measures, technology failures, standardization, calibration, and integration? Probably one of the most important things to think about is when we look at these technologies, it's very easy to show this kind of data. I can take a graph, for example, and show you that if we have rumination time, that cows with or without ketosis, cows that don't have ketosis ruminate more than cows that do. Cows that have a higher fat protein ratio are more likely to have ketosis, and showing significant differences here. Cows that have milk fever lie down more than cows that don't. And we tend to present this information and say, look, these are the variables that you should use to identify these conditions. But I think we have to go beyond that. We need to be thinking about, if I have a technology, how many times do we find the condition? So if I have, for example, 100 metritis events, 80 times the technology finds it, 20 it misses it. That's an 80% what we call sensitivity. The other side of that question is, if I have 100 alerts telling me a cow has metritis, 90 times it's correct, and 10 times it's wrong, 10 false positives, then I have what we call 90% specificity. Now, a lot of people would say this combination of 80%, 90%, 80% sensitivity, 90% specificity, that's not good enough. But I've never seen a technology that has that kind of a combination. It's hard to get the two together, because I can change the threshold and make one go up, but the other one goes down. These two are always fighting each other. We have to think about the balance between the two. And the biggest issue tends to come in the number of false positives. This is some real data looking at different systems that we looked at. And we looked at the sensitivity and specificity here and among different systems. And you can see we were not ever able to get to that level I just mentioned. So either we have more false positives or more false negatives. This is the reality of the situation. We have to be willing to accept some of those. And we also see wide ranges among different technologies. We also had another study that we did where we had 1,200 cows on 4 farms, and the farmers had to record what they did with the information. And in this case, they actually only looked at 1/3 of the alerts. 2/3 of the time, they ignored the alerts. Why? There were too many false positives. And eventually, they looked at fewer and fewer of the alerts because they sort of lost faith in the system. And this is an example of 2 cows from that study, where you can see that here what we have is the pink bars represent when the system said there was a problem. The blue stars represent when there was actually a problem. And you can see a lot of mismatches here. Times when the system said there was something going on, but there was actually nothing going on with the animal. And times when there was something going on with the animal, but the system didn't pick it up. These are 2 cows, 4-month periods. Imagine taking this across all 1,200 cows. With this system, 1,200 cows, 1-year project, 24,000 alerts. There weren't that many problems going on with the cows. So this is a reality check that we have to keep in mind. Now, there are differences among systems. One of the things that I think really helps is when you bring in something like what SCR has in terms of their health index. This takes it away from just a yes-no scenario. You have different levels of concern. The producers then can determine, based on the condition, how many animals there are on the list that day, et cetera, what level of risk that they're going to take in looking at these alerts. I think this red-yellow type of an approach to identifying which animals need attention is very, very practical, very, very useful in helping deal with that balance of sensitivity and specificity that I talked about. I think we need to remember and make sure that we don't assume just because somebody says something measures it, that it measures it. We need third-party validations that look at whether these technologies really measure what they say that they're measuring. Just because technology A measures rumination well doesn't mean technology B can. And we see when we look at this, there are really differences among technologies. Some of them are excellent, and some of them really struggle at measuring what they say that they're going to measure. This is an example of how that reflects. This was a study we did. There were 135 cows in the study. This is just looking at days 1 to 21 in milk. There were 3 different technologies on the same cows measuring rumination time. And on average, there was 100 minutes difference per day. There were 4 different technologies measuring line time. And on average, there was 3 hours a day difference. And there were 3 different technologies measuring number of steps, and on average, over 2,000 steps difference. What does this tell us? They're not all measuring the same thing. Which one's measuring correctly? Not always clear. Now, if they're measuring and we're looking at the changes, and they're measuring consistently, maybe it doesn't matter that they're not exactly the same. But one of the things I think we have to be really careful here is comparing herd A with technology 1 with herd B with technology 2 and saying, you're better at this herd than at rumination or line time, when it may just be they're using a different tag. You've got to be really careful in how we interpret these types of data across farms. We also had this great idea with this study that we were going to take all these different technologies, put them on the same cows, and we were going to create some super algorithm, basically saying it's all these different things combined that give us useful information. We weren't able to do it. Why? Because only 29% of the time were all the technologies actually working at the same time. They were randomly failing at that high of a rate. Now, of course, maybe it was each of them were 80%, but 80% times 80% times 80% gets you down to 29% eventually. Lots of challenges with disease, meeting those sensitivity, specificity challenges, calibration across time. Do we automatically divert milk or alert? What do we do when we have a system that occurs? We have huge within cow and within herd variations with these variables. There are lots of management and environmental factors that affect these variables. Changes in temperature, changes in whether it's raining or snowing has a big impact on these numbers. And we have to keep that in mind. Group changes and pen changes have major effects on these behaviors. Some cows just simply don't read the book. It just doesn't make sense on some cows, and not all these changes are linear, as I discussed earlier. This is my friend David Corbin. David taught me probably the most I can think I've understood about technologies. He was a farmer that initially, the company we were working with said that this technology would not work. This guy was not going to make it work because he could hardly use a computer mouse. But he's technology super user today because he really understands cows. He's able to take his cow knowledge and it's taking him to a new level. Good managers, good cow guys like David are the ones that get the most value out of technologies. Those that look at it as an easy way out, as a simple solution for bad management, are going to struggle. These are the people that will succeed the most. Moving forward, I think we'll see more of these data-driven dairies. Data-driven dairies treat data as an asset. They understand some basic statistics. They manage with KPIs and dashboards. They look forward, not just backwards, and they connect production to finance. I think we have lots of opportunities to identify disease prospectively, being able to determine what's the course of action after an alert. Do we culture? Do we treat? Some kind of other intervention? And I think we need to do more economic assessment of the benefits of early disease identification. We need more developments of standard for looking at these technologies' usefulness, address the need for alerts. I think we need to move away from conditions either being yes, no, we have some degree of infection, degree of having the condition, and try to capture the complexity of clinical and subclinical disease. How can we help as advisors? We can help people understand the pros and cons of the systems, help them understand the investment economics, help them create a plan for using the data, and develop protocols for therapeutics, treatment, and culling. So I think we have a lot of opportunities for disease detection, estrus detection moving forward. It's very exciting, but we do need to maintain realistic expectations. I hope that you picked up a few hints today that you hadn't thought of before, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Let's give them a round of applause. So we got time for maybe just one or two real quick questions. Anybody? So just quickly, I mean, Jeffrey, you talked, I mean, my head's spinning of all the new technologies. If I'm a dairyman and I'm thinking, okay, where do I start? Maybe give us one or two action points of all this data. Where would I start to look at what technology I should look at?
I think the key is to start with what are my needs as an individual producer. Not to start about, I need to buy technology, but do I have a need that I need filled that a technology might help? So if I have challenges in reproductive management, maybe that's an indication for a heat detection technology. If I'm having challenges in fresh cow disease, maybe that's an indication for a rumination or eating time technology. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. It's what helps my particular operation at this point in time.
Any other? Here we go.
Yeah, my name is Jan, dairy producer from Minnesota. Any devices, and I'm not really much of a guru on all this technology, but is there any device that you can, if they send you in a pen of 300 cows, a device that can tell you where that cow is?
There are a couple of devices that can do that now, yes. There's at least a couple of real-time location systems out now that would do that. And then there's systems where basically you have your smartphone that if you're within proximity of the animal, identify where that animal is.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Once again, Jeffrey's part of the Alltech on-farm support team. And if there's anything we can help you with out on the farms, please don't hesitate to ask. And Jeffrey's just one of our 7 people that we have available. So with that, thank you and appreciate your time today.